Welcome to Self-Love Actually, a podcast that will provide guidance and support along your self-love journey. I'm your host, Haley Curtis, a self-love life coach who helps people better love themselves by creating a life they dream of living. My purpose in creating this podcast is that it allows you to love yourself a little more, each and every episode. In this episode, we are focusing on boundaries. We are getting clear on what boundaries are and also how and when to implement them. Today's guest is Amy Fiedler. Amy is a 3-time published author of personal development books. She holds professional certifications as a holistic life coach, Reiki master practitioner, ordained minister, and trauma support specialist. I found Amy through Instagram and was thrilled she agreed to join me on this episode about boundaries. Amy, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for being here. Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your background?
So I am a certified holistic life coach, a certified trauma support specialist, and a Reiki master practitioner. I've been doing this for about 8.5 years now, and I work with men, women, and children globally, basically supporting them in their emotional needs, providing them coping tools, helping them to process trauma, learn how to communicate in nonviolent ways, and set those essential boundaries to really improve the relationships in their life.
Wow, that sounds like something everyone could benefit from. How would you describe boundaries to someone who has never set a boundary in their life?
Well, that's speaking to my younger self, right? I grew up without any boundaries, without any knowledge of what a boundary even was. To somebody who's never understood what that is or heard that word before, the best way to describe it to them is to think about it being like a fence around your house, right? So if you leave the fence door open to your yard, people can just walk in and out. People can play in your yard. They can leave things in your yard. They can steal things from your yard. So you want to shut that fence, and then you want to decide who's allowed in or not. When that comes to our interpersonal relationships with people, what we need to learn is what do we want, what do we need, and what do we value? Being able to communicate that from the I perspective to people, saying, I need support here in my life, and here's how I can receive that best. When you speak to me calmly, when you validate my feelings, when you provide me solutions when I'm feeling anxious, giving them directions on how we need to be treated is really what a boundary is.
That's awesome. I love the visual that the fence gives. That's a great analogy.
It's helpful to think about it that way because we complicate relationships. So when you think about it in a very basic sense of like the front door to your house or the fence around your yard, you're kind of like, yeah, I don't just like open the door to my house and let anybody come in. And some people have rules before you come in, right? Like take off your shoes or, put your jacket here. So when you think about that in our relationships, it's like, oh, this is not silly to ask for somebody to be kind to me or validating.
What are a few indicators that a boundary needs to be set?
An indicator that a boundary needs to be set is that you are feeling annoyed, you are feeling disrespected, you are feeling irritated, frustrated, any type of negative emotion in an interaction with another person or, in an environment that you're in. If you're feeling annoyed by something, what I always tell clients is you're avoiding something. Because we get annoyed because we like to blame it on the other person. But normally, if we speak up in that moment and communicate our need, we are no longer annoyed because we've let them know, hey, stop doing this, or I'm not available for this. And then that annoyance kind of leaves us. So those indicators are always your negative emotions. Negative emotions will provide you the guidance in where a boundary needs to be set wherever you are or whoever you're with.
And I'd imagine you have to really cultivate awareness around those negative emotions before you're even able to realize, oh, I need to set a boundary here.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of people are so tolerant. And I was once one of them, right? If you grow up in an environment where you're forced to have to deal with people mistreating you, then what happens is you become an adult who goes out into your other relationships and you endure different types of abuse. And you don't even know you're doing it because that's normal and that feels like home, but home was not healthy, home was not safe. So if you're not tuned in or aware, as you said, of those emotions, then you're going to put up with a lot more. I'll always say to people, you have to get sick of your own shit, because sometimes you can't identify, I'm feeling frustrated here, because frustration is a normal emotion for you. So really, you just have to kind of like run on that hamster wheel until you are sick of it. And then you're like, enough, I have to say something.
What are some common mistakes that people make when setting a boundary?
There's so many mistakes people make, but the biggest one people make is they like to blame, attack, and threaten when they communicate. So that's why I always say a boundary is communicated from the I perspective. When you say, you're doing this and you need to stop, then the person on the receiving end of that information is definitely going to get defensive because you are blaming them, you are attacking them, and you're clearly angry. And that's normal for us to feel that way and want to kind of spew that out. But you have to own your emotions. And owning your emotions is you saying, I'm feeling anxious right now, and it would be helpful if you spoke to me this way instead. So not attacking, not making threats. You better do this or else is a threat and an ultimatum. That's not a boundary. I want people in my life who respect my feelings. If you're not capable of respecting my feelings, then maybe we should reconsider this relationship, is a much more respectful and healthy way to communicate that boundary.
What happens when, it may be a family member or, I don't know, a roommate, someone that you can't quite escape from when you say, ending this relationship, or what else would be the alternative there?
I mean, the goal with our close and intimate relationships with people is that we both want to find common ground. We both want each other to feel supported and respected. Does that happen in every situation? No, right? Some people have to reach the point where they're like, I love my family. However, this person just keeps disrespecting me. But to your specific question, right? Like, let's say it's like a roommate or you live with your family and you don't have the financial means or you don't have a way to get away from that. The goal is to uphold your boundary to the best of your ability. And sometimes that's very personal choice on how you do that. But sometimes it means you reiterate it to them in a firmer way. And I have classes that I have taught in my online resource center where I use this example. When my dog was alive, I would bring him to my parents' house and they would babysit. And my mom does not like to follow any rules. She always knew better than me. And I used to just send a whole bunch of snacks, like just the entire bag of dog treats to her, and she'd give them all to him. I was like, he's a tiny Pomeranian. You cannot do that. He gets sick. And she couldn't hear it because she was like, no, I know better than you. And he loves them. I'm like, okay, all right. So what I had to do was, I see this person is not respecting me or my boundaries when it comes to my dog. And she's clearly not willing to hear me. So I have to remove the margin of error when it comes to what I'm saying. So in other words, I once handed her the whole bag of treats and I learned very quickly, that's not smart. Don't do that. So what I did was I took a few treats out and I put them in a Ziploc bag and I gave them. And I thought, common sense, you'd break them into pieces and give them to the tiny dog. She didn't do that. She just handed him the whole treat. And I was like, lesson learned. Let's remove that margin of error a little bit more. So then the next time I took them and I broke them into bite-sized pieces, counted them and gave them to her. And then she got it right. And I was like, okay, sometimes you have to kind of, and for lack of a better way to say this, dumb it down for someone because they're in their own head. they're believing their own thoughts. They think they know better, whatever the case may be. So you just remove any room for a mistake. And then when there's no wiggle room left, they're either going to get it right or they're going to get it very obviously wrong. And then you're probably going to hit that threshold of like, can't watch my dog anymore, mom. Right. So that's what you want to do. Right. But obviously it depends on the context or the circumstances for sure.
Right. And it sounds like it's a lot of like trial and error. Like you don't just set a boundary and get it right the first time, especially if it's with someone you really care about and love and want to nurture this relationship. It's about kind of how can I improve the next time I try this out?
Yeah, that's the truth. It's not a one and done deal. Boundaries are with you forever in these relationships. They're probably going to evolve over time. And so as you grow and you mature and you learn new ways to communicate things or your needs change, you're going to have to communicate these. So the willingness to communicate, the willingness to ask for what you need is really important as well.
Why are setting boundaries essential to self-love?
If we don't set those boundaries, then what happens is we abandon our needs, we abandon our wants, we abandon the things we value, and we send ourselves a message of self-neglect. In order to love ourselves, we need to listen to ourselves, and then we need to respect ourselves enough to advocate for what we're needing and wanting. I listen to so many people go, I don't owe people that explanation or that conversation when it comes to my needs. They should just know. That's telling me you don't love yourself enough to want to speak up for yourself and claim the need or the want or the value that you're seeking. So, it's not so much that you owe it to people, you owe it to yourself. You want to speak up for yourself and say, I need this. This is important to me. This is of value to me. It makes me feel at peace or it makes me feel secure. I deserve that, right? Those are all the messages we send ourselves. Without that, we're just ignoring. And if you think about it from a child's perspective, if a child goes up to his mom and he's crying and he's wanting attention and he's like, mom, 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 and she just turns her head and puts it in her phone and ignores and neglects that child, that's what we do as adults when we don't set boundaries.
What would be your advice for someone who just struggles to keep their boundaries?
My advice would be to get really clear on the value of why you need that boundary. What I'll have individuals do when they work with me is really, really, really get down to the nitty-gritty of what happens to you. Like, what is the trajectory of your emotional state or your behavior pattern or your mindset if you don't set that boundary? So a great example of this is like, for me, a very big boundary in my close relationships is if you're angry, do not raise your voice with me. Just communicate what you're feeling and we can talk it out. And that's because I have trauma from childhood. When people raise their voice, I just freeze and it's not going to be a good situation. If I don't communicate this boundary and I encounter someone who raises their voice and starts yelling when they're upset, the trajectory for me is my body goes into fight or flight mode. I freeze. Now my whole day is shot because I can't think. I can't do anything. I'm frozen. Now I'm scared of you. So now there's a wedge between our relationship. I'm not going to want to encounter this again. So now I don't know how to move forward with you. I'm anxious and all these negative emotions are kind of recycling themselves inside. So for me, that's not something I want. So the value behind me speaking up for myself is to basically prevent that from taking place. And if I don't speak up, that could possibly take place. And then it's not going to be good for anybody. If you get clear, I'm going to get really anxious. And then the rest of my day goes to shit. I can't talk to anybody. I can't think straight, whatever. If you have that clarity on what happens without that boundary, that's going to send you right in the direction of it's really important that I speak up right now.
Right. And it sounds like both options aren't easy. Like Setting a boundary is very, very difficult. And also, if you don't set the boundary, it lingers on throughout your whole day. So like both are very hard to do. It's just a matter of doing the right thing out of self-love for yourself.
Yeah, 1,000%. You have to know you're worth it and you deserve it, which, is a very basic way of putting it, because the truth is that not a lot of people believe they're worth it. And not a lot of people find it easy to speak up for themselves. And if they've got people pleasing patterns or trauma or codependency, things like that, you really have to start to work through those to get to that point where you're like, I deserve it. There's value here. I can communicate it and I know what to do if this doesn't go the right way. Like I know how to uphold that boundary.
Right. And it goes back to trial and error too. Like you're not going to get it the first time, especially if you're setting a boundary for the first time. There's lots to learn and it's a practice, right? Like you get better the more you set boundaries.
Yeah, 1,000%. Like I said, I didn't grow up with any people in my family didn't demonstrate an example of setting boundaries. It was the exact opposite. So for me to be sitting here being like, hey, I'm kind of an expert on this now, shows you what's possible, right? Like it does take time and practice. And like we discussed earlier, you're going to grow, your needs are going to change. And so you're always going to encounter a situation where you're like, hey, like I've never been here before. I'm not really sure what to say, but you've been setting boundaries for years. So yeah, it's trial and error for sure.
Those are all the questions I have about boundaries, but I did have some standard questions that I ask every guest that I'd like to ask you. What is your first memory of an act of self-love?
My first memory of an act of self-love is probably when I started staring at myself. That's so silly, but it works. Staring at myself in the mirror naked and just making eye contact with myself to get comfortable with what I look like and who I am, and that sense of like intimacy with yourself. I listened for years to people saying, do mirror work or like sit down in front of the mirror and talk to yourself. You got to learn to love yourself. And I'm like, I grew up in a house where people didn't have a lot of nice things to say, but strangers did. Like I was always told I was beautiful, but then I'd come home and not necessarily feel beautiful, right? So standing in the mirror, buck naked, and just latching eyes with yourself and not fidgeting, like just staring at yourself, is probably I dare anybody to do this, probably one of the most uncomfortable things to do, but like it's a game changer. You suddenly are like, oh yeah, that's me. And I like me and I'm comfortable with me.
Wow, that does sound like an uncomfortable practice.
Yeah, it is.
But also so beautiful because, there's something to be said with that. I mean, we came into the world naked and we were beautiful then. So what has changed from then to now?
Right. I think on that note, like sometimes you add clothes and accessories and hair color and makeup and all of those things, and you strip away who you really were at the start, right? So if you can get comfortable with who you really are without all of that, and then put it back on and be like, okay, yeah, it enhances things or it makes me feel a little bit more confident or beautiful or whatever, then like you've got a nice solid foundation there. But when that foundation is cracked and you're just adding, and then trying to love yourself from that angle, it's kind of like you already know that's not really you. So strip it down and love you and then put it back on. Because there's nothing wrong with having it all on, for crying out loud. Like we all love it.
Yeah, no, but that's great advice for anyone who's just at a starting point with self-love and doesn't know where to really start. Try looking at yourself naked in the mirror.
Yeah, Amy dares you. Yeah.
Okay, what is your current favorite self-love practice and why?
Cooking for myself, like, is a huge act of love for me. Like that really resonates with me because I don't know if you've ever had a meal cooked by somebody who is angry, like you can taste it. It doesn't matter how good they are at cooking, you can taste it. So for me, just the thought of like, I'm taking the time for myself to nourish myself and I'm putting love into it. And then I'm kind of like eating and swallowing that love is symbolic, but also it just always feels good to me. So that's kind of a non-negotiable. As much as I can cook throughout the week, I do. Another big one for me is I go for weekly massages. And that's kind of my form of like mind body therapy. I've been with my massage therapist for years at this point. So I'm able to talk through things and process things. And then she kind of connects the dots for me on like, oh, you have pain in your body here, and this is what it means emotionally for you. And I'm a deep person. So when I can have that space to myself where the attention is completely on me and I can just go balls to the wall, like talking about the shit that makes me geek out, that is super, super nourishing. And without it, like I can feel a difference. The third one is journaling. I'm a middle child, not to, stake claim to that title of we always feel neglected and forgotten, but we definitely always feel neglected and forgotten. So I like being heard because I never felt heard growing up. And I tend to kind of talk a lot when somebody's listening, which is why I work well here because people are listening to me. But in my personal life, it's not all about Amy. So in my journal, it is all about Amy. I can create that outlet for myself to really feel seen and heard in a way that I know is rather unfair to put on other people to that level, right? Like their job isn't to fill the void that my parents left. Their job is to listen and support, but I have to kind of do the heavy lifting there. So if I don't sit down and kind of journal out everything in my head, then my boyfriend gets a earful.
Right. It's like, it's a great outlet for you.
Yes.
Awesome. Those were great practices. I love asking these questions because everyone has something different to say.
I mean, isn't it interesting, right? And then you learn new ones now. You're going to be like, Amy, I'm going to go try to stand in front of the mirror and make it.
Exactly. And like also with the self-love practices, like something like cooking, like I cook all the time, but I've never thought of it as a self-love practice. And these actions of self-love are all about the intention behind it. Like you have the intention of nourishing yourself and loving yourself and eating love. I loved that. And so just shifting your mind to have a self-love intention behind the things that you may already be doing can really make a difference.
Well put. I think that's really the clincher there is it's the intent, because we can do so many things and one person can view it one way, as you said, you didn't look at cooking from that angle, but then you hear it and you're like, oh, wow, now I can't unhear it. So now I'm going to perceive this differently for myself. So it's cool. It's cool that you ask those questions too, because you probably get a lot of different ideas that now you can go play with in your own life.
Yeah. And I also hope that it gives just listeners an idea of what they can also do and practice different practices of self-love. Well, Amy, this is the close of our episode. Where can people find you?
I love to hang out on Instagram, so they can jump over there. There's tons of free resources right on my page. I put a lot of time and energy into the captions to provide people coping tools and solutions. So they can follow me at Amy the Life Coach, or they can head right to my website and check out any of my services or resources, which is amyfiedler.com.
Awesome. And you also have a podcast, right?
I do. It's called Connect the Dots, Bitch. And it's just me, no guests, but we really dive into topics like boundary setting, nonviolent communication, toxic relationships, ghosting, all of those kind of popular topics that you also are going to find information about on my page, but you'll hear much more personal stories and thoughts, rather unfiltered on my podcast.
Awesome. So if y'all enjoyed today's episode, definitely go check out Amy. And thank you so much for taking the time to join us on this episode.
Thank you so much for listening, self-lovers. If you enjoyed this episode, please let me know by leaving a review and subscribing to this podcast. And if you really loved it, please share this episode with a friend. This episode wouldn't have been possible without our production partner, Pinto Media. Making this podcast has been so easy with their help. If you're thinking of starting a podcast on your own, check out their page on Instagram at produced_by_Pinto, Pinto. If you're ready to level up your self-love game outside of this podcast, you can book a free clarity call with me to see if we would be a good fit for one another. I help my clients achieve their goals fueled by self-love. You can head to my website, haleycurtis.com, or check out the show notes below. If you have any suggestions or feedback for me about future episodes, please email me at hello@haleycurtis.com or DM me on Instagram at @IamHaleyCurtis. I really want to make sure that these episodes best serve you. That is it for today, self-lovers. I will meet you again on our next episode.